This conversation on the neuroscience of empathy and compassion features Dr. Thupten Jinpa, president of the Compassion Institute, Dr. Stephen Trzeciak, chair of medicine at the Cooper Medical School of Rowan University, Dr. Richard Davidson, the founder and director of the Center for Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin, and is moderated by Dr. William Mobley, Associate Dean of Neurosciences at the University of California, San Diego.
Glad you could join us for this session on the neuroscience of empathy and compassion. We welcome you to this discussion. I'm Bill Mobley, and I'm a director of the T. Denny Sanford Institute for Empathy and Compassion here at UCSD. It's my pleasure to lead an effort, a new effort really, only over the last 2 years, that focuses on these two very important aspects of brain function, empathy and compassion. The ability to understand another one's feelings and motivated by that to reach out with kindly thoughts and with kindly actions. This is a work of great importance for mankind because it ultimately helps us understand and care for one another and for our planet. So the Institute is really dedicated to advancing that cause. We've, again, been around only for a couple of years, but of course we're informed by a very long tradition around empathy and compassion, about which we'll speak. We're also informed by a recent but very burgeoning, powerful neuroscience of empathy and compassion, about which we'll speak. And then finally, we understand the enormous value of being able to apply empathy and compassion in our daily lives, and we'll also speak about that. The Institute really then has three objectives. The first is to explore the neuroscience of empathy and compassion. The second is to employ its resources to train in empathy and compassion. And the third is to let the second inform the first, if you will, that let practice inform neuroscience and neuroscience inform practice. This is, for us, a passion, a growing passion. And again, we're very happy to have you with us today. Our first focus in the Institute is on medical students and faculty. We reasoned that these folks were really in the, if you will, the eye of the hurricane when it comes to the need to be empathic and compassionate. But we hope to expand our mission very broadly beyond the medical school here at UCSD to other medical schools, but really to the populace in general. I'm really pleased to be joined by three colleagues today, each of them expert in their own very special way. The first is Thupten Jinpa, PhD, who's president of the Compassion Institute. He and I have been on a long journey together, really more than 15 years now, beginning in Dharamsala, where we met with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, to begin to think about the conversation, if you will, between basic neuroscience and traditional philosophy and practice around empathy and compassion. And Jinpa's been a great, good friend for many, many years. He's a former Tibetan monk, the English interpreter for the Dalai Lama, and really a specialist and a very skillful scholar in Tibetan Buddhist philosophy. And so with that, I'd like to turn to Jinpa to begin to tell us a little bit about the traditions of empathy and compassion that arose in your home in Tibet and nearby. So Jinpa, welcome.
Thank you. First of all, it's a real honor and pleasure to be participating in this 5th International Vatican Conference. I wish we could be able to do this in person in this beautiful Vatican City, but maybe next time. But thank you for the question and inviting me. When it comes to empathy and compassion, I think there is a very long history in human interest, going all the way back to the early days of the formation of the spiritual traditions. And it's no wonder that when you look at all the great traditions of the world, when it comes to the foundation of the ethical teachings, there's a striking convergence. Because at the heart of the ethical teaching is the question of how do I treat my fellow human beings, especially the person in front of me. And strikingly, all the great traditions come to the single insight, which is really the golden rule. just as you would like to be treated by the other person. So that has formed the bedrock for the ethical teachings. Now, the difference is that in my own tradition, which comes from India and Tibet, there is an emphasis on actually learning to train our mind. So there's a lot more emphasis on the techniques and cultivation, and partly because the Tibetan tradition is not a faith-based tradition, it's more a philosophy, psychology-based tradition. So there is a lot of interest in how it can be trained. And, to put it put it in a nutshell, there is this understanding that, first of all, compassion is a very natural human impulse. Empathy and compassion comes as part of who we are. Now, of course, the explanation of their naturalness may differ from philosophy to science, but there is an understanding it's natural. Secondly, there is also a recognition that empathy and compassion can be a very powerful motivating factor. That, again, is the idea. And therefore, it's the foundation of ethics, because ethics involve how do you treat the person in front of you, fellow human beings. So if you can bring compassion and empathy as part of your value underpinning of your ethical action, your orientation and attitude towards other people completely changes. And then the third thing is compassion is also very relational. It's not turning inwards and looking at a fascinating aspect of the mind. It's really relational. It has to do with action. So all of these really are recognized. Now, the difference is now with science, we can begin to actually measure them, tease out the specific aspects, and also begin to understand. And one of the things is that there is also a recognition that compassion is very powerful in the sense of providing a sense of purpose. I mean, that's one of the reasons why you can see among truly compassionate individuals, there is a genuine sense of purpose. And because of the sense of purpose, there is a joy in individuals. So normally when we think about compassion in a conventional sense, because we associate it so much with dealing with suffering, joy doesn't come to our mind when we think of compassion. But truly, when compassion arises, there is a joy, there's a sense of purpose. So these are important insights that the spiritual traditions have discovered. And now with the help of science, we can probably formalize the understanding, measure them, tease out the constructs so they can be actually correlated with behavior, so that then that insight can be shared more widely. So that's why having science and medicine and traditional insights coming together is a beautiful, beautiful marriage.
Jinpa, thank you. I remember very well when we were in Dharamsala for the first time, and we had a discussion, and it went something like this. The Dalai Lama, Buddhist philosophers really don't need Westerners' help when it comes to spiritual traditions. We've got those and they work very well. Thanks very much. And our philosophy, we're happy with that. We don't really need your help with philosophy. But the science would be very, very helpful to bring alongside our tradition. And then the question to you was, why? And the answer, as I remember it, was because putting science to what has really largely been a spiritual, philosophical tradition makes it more credible, makes it more translatable, makes it scalable. Jinpa, what do you think? Does that sound about right?
Well, I would also add one important factor, which is science's ability to naturalize a phenomena. So because science is a very universal approach, and when science gets involved, it has this ability to naturalize the language and make it more accessible and universal. So science really allows the possibilities of cutting across all the differences that generally tend to be rooted in traditions and language and frameworks and so on. And that's one power of science. And then, of course, on top of that, when you can measure something, everybody feels it's real. So I think there is that advantage as well.
And we heard His Holiness say that very clearly at the conference we participated in. Just measure something. He didn't tell us what to measure. He just said measure something. Because measures are believable. It's interesting to me, the contrast. I mean, the key words that we're using: empathy and compassion, natural, motivating, ethically bound, relational, purposeful, joyful, which seems like it describes all of humanity. And yet, we have wars and we have conflicts and we have A angry at B and B angry at A. And so what I hear you saying, but I'd like to have you expound on that, is can science basically take what is a natural, ethically bound, joyful practice and make it more accessible across different groups, different countries, different religions, different political philosophies?
I truly believe, because if you look at the modern education system, modern education system evolved in a Western cultural context. But today, nobody disputes the teaching of maths or science and many of the social sciences and so on. So there's no reason why something like insight into compassion, when the science has a way of explaining it and kind of operationalizing the construct and then coming up with recommendations for possible cultivation practices, there's no reason why cultural differences should really come in the way of embracing them, because in the end, we are talking about basic human condition and basic human experience.
Mm-hmm. I think it's very exciting to think that science can play a very powerful role here. Let me turn now to Richard Davidson, PhD, Richie's a professor of psychology and psychiatry at the University of Wisconsin, where he's the founding director of the Center for Healthy Minds. Richie has made absolutely unique contributions to understanding the neuroscience of empathy and compassion. And we're so importantly informed by what he's done, and really by the burgeoning of this field of neuroscience. It's part of social neuroscience, but it's neuroscience writ large. We're so impressed by that and so helped by that I can say for sure the Institute probably wouldn't exist if it weren't for Richie and his colleagues, who have really been the point of the spear when it comes to bringing science to the biology of empathy and compassion. So Richie, welcome.
Thank you so much, Bill, and thank you for all you're doing to help to bring these topics and this message to the broader community.
So Richie, let's talk about the neuroscience of empathy and compassion. What do we know, and where do we need to go, and what are the challenges?
Yeah, well, thank you first for having me, and it really is also an honor for me to be here at this Vatican meeting. Scientific research on this topic is quite recent. I remember the very first time I met His Holiness the Dalai Lama. It was in 1992. And he challenged me on that day. I was doing a lot of research at that time, more on the adversity side of the equation and studying the brain mechanisms associated with vulnerability to anxiety and depression and so forth. And His Holiness asked me a simple and innocent question. He said, why can't you use the same tools of neuroscience to study anxiety that you've been using to study anxiety and depression? Why can't you use those same tools to study kindness and compassion? And it was the beginning of a wake-up call for me. I mention that to underscore the infancy of the work. While we have learned a lot, there's still a lot that we don't know. One of the most important things that we've learned is that the circuits for empathy and the circuits for compassion seem to be different. And when we empathize with a person, particularly when we empathize with a person who may be suffering, for example, a person who is in pain, research shows that the empathizer activates networks in her or his brain that are similar to the networks that are activated in the person who is experiencing the pain. And we know from modern neuroscience something about the pain matrix, as it's been called, the network of regions in the brain that are activated by pain. And when a person is empathizing with someone in pain, they show the same pattern of activation, even though they themselves are not exposed to the painful stimulus or the painful conditions that might have given rise to this pattern of activation. Now, that is a very different pattern than we see in a person who is generating compassion. A person who's generating compassion shows activation that includes the ventral striatum, which is a region, an area of the brain that we know plays some role in certain kinds of positive emotion. We also know it's a region that is involved in motivated action, which is so central, as you were suggesting, Bill and Jinpa, in compassion. Compassion is a state that prepares a person to act when suffering is encountered. And I think it's so pertinent to helping professions, because often people in helping professions complain of what they describe as compassion burnout. But I think what more likely is occurring is empathy burnout. They are exhibiting, if you will, excessive empathy, which is activating these networks in the brain that are associated with a lot of negative affect, negative emotion. And when that occurs cumulatively over time, it could be very toxic and can actually impair a person's ability to act skillfully to help relieve the suffering. So this distinction between empathy and compassion, I think, has been made very clearly in the neuroscience, and I think it's very helpful in the application of these strategies in real-world contexts.
But you know, I really resonate with with the idea that we need to be skillful in our empathic responses. At one level, empathy is contagious. At one level, and it's a natural part of our brain, if one infant in the neonatal nursery starts to cry, they all cry. I'm pretty sure they didn't have a conversation and agree to sort of form a new choir. They're just responding to one another. There's something about the brain that says you need to resonate with those around you, even if you're a tiny infant. And yet, if your pain, Richie, is my pain, then there is an aversion to knowing about your pain. If your pain is really just my pain too, then one can understand why people avoid empathy, because my goodness, if I was really going to resonate with that person, if I was really going to understand fully, but not only understand, but feel fully their pain, then I'd be in pain. And medical professionals, of course, would be in pain every day, all day. Every time they walked in the room in an oncology clinic, they'd have a new cancer. Well, so something the Dalai Lama said to us, and he said it, I think, in a way that I didn't quite understand at the time. But we were showing him pictures of Tanya Singer's very early study, showing this overlap of brain activations for empathy for pain and the pain receiver, but the loving family member who is watching it, not feeling the pain themselves, but watching the pain in their loved one. And he said, we must develop a wise compassion. I think he meant to say a wise empathy, a skillful empathy, an empathy that can see the pain, can understand it, at some level can feel it, but at the same time understands that it is not personally their pain, it is the pain of another. Richie, isn't that an important piece of biology we need to learn how to do better?
Yes, I think you're pointing to some extremely interesting and important issues, Bill, and the examples that you gave, I think, are very, very helpful. And at the outset, you were also asking about what are the questions that are not yet answered that we still need to pursue. And this is really one of them. And so one of the intuitions that we have is that it may well be that empathy is a necessary precursor to compassion. In order to express compassion, it's very important and maybe necessary to have the direct experience of another person's suffering. And it's quite interesting in this regard. There is some neuroscientific research on a group of people that the scientists have called extraordinary altruists. What is an extraordinary altruist? How is it operationalized? Here, it was operationalized as a person who donates a kidney to an unrelated individual. I think most of us would agree that that's a highly altruistic action. And these scientists explored what might be different in the extraordinary altruist brain and looked at parameters of brain structure. And one thing that has emerged from that work that's so interesting is that the extraordinary altruists have larger amygdala. And it may be, this now is conjecture, but it may be that the amygdala is playing a role in the immediate sensing of another person's suffering. And that then triggers other brain circuits which are critical to act on that initial impulse. And this is where your suggestion, Bill, of skillful action, I think, is so important. So not just wallowing in the other person's suffering, but then moving on and actually doing something that would be practical to help relieve the suffering.
Richie, thanks so much. And when I think of people who observe suffering and have to, in some way, maintain this tension between feeling it and understanding it's not theirs, between feeling it, but being able to take a perspective on it that allows them to make really careful decisions. I think of physicians. And so we're joined by Stephen Trzeciak, who's an MD, who's chief of medicine at Cooper Union Medical School, and who, together with his co-author, Anthony Mazzarelli, wrote the book Compassionomics. And I would just say that this is probably one of the most important books in medicine in the last several years, because it brings us to understanding compassion, the science, but also the clinical manifestations of compassion in medicine. And so, Steve, welcome, and thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much, Bill. Thank you for the invitation to be with you today and for leading your institute and helping to advance the field. The messages today are resonating with me as well, as compassion is deeply rooted in tradition, as Jinpa shared, but probably because compassion is so deeply rooted in neuroscience, as Richie shared. And my job as a physician scientist is doing the research to figure out how does compassion integrate with our daily lives and our daily work. And in my case, in the work of taking care of patients. Really, the question is, does compassion really matter? Now, you may say, of course, compassion matters. It's vital to the art of medicine. And of course, I would agree, and I would always agree it's a cornerstone of the art of medicine. But is it only in the art of medicine, or are there also evidence-based effects belonging in the science of medicine? And what is the evidence? In our work in Compassionomics, we looked at familiar things in unfamiliar ways. So rather than looking at compassion through a moral, ethical lens or an emotional, sentimental lens, we aim to look at compassion through the lens of science. And we curated data from more than 1,000 scientific abstracts, over 280 original science research papers. It was a year-long journey through the data. And what we found ultimately is that compassion matters. not just in meaningful ways, but also in measurable ways. Compassion matters for patients, for patient care, and for those who care for patients. For patients, more human connection has physiological effects, has psychological effects. More compassion is associated with more caring and more quality of care, higher quality of care. For example, fewer medical errors, perhaps because when you care deeply, you're more meticulous about the care you provide and less prone to making errors. But also sticking in the practical, if you care deeply about patients and they know that, they're more likely to take their medicine. There's also, and this is where the distinction between empathy and compassion that Richie was sharing is so important. There is abundant evidence that compassion matters for the giver too. And that's so important now because we have a worldwide epidemic of burnout among healthcare providers. And that was before we had a pandemic. Now, I remember back in medical school, I was taught, don't care too much because too much caring, too much compassion will burn you out. But when we went through all the data and examined it through the lens of science, we found that there's actually an association between compassion and burnout, but it's inverse. So high compassion, low burnout, low compassion, high burnout. And why would that be? Well, my colleague Anthony Mazzarelli and I, we believe it's because of relationships. If you care about patients and have a compassionate bond with patients, you get the fulfilling part of what it means to take care of people. And in that fulfillment, it builds resilience and resistance to burnout. And if you don't have that, then all you're left with is a really stressful job. So to illustrate this, I'd like to share with you a story, if that's okay. So sure. It's a story that a physician shared with us in our book, Compassionomics. And the story is this. A couple of years ago, after nearly 20 years of working in an ICU, an intensive care unit, and literally meeting people on the worst day of their lives, I came to a stark realization. I had almost every symptom of burnout. Let me assure you, it's not a good place to be. It can be a dark place. Currently, the recommended prescription for burnout in healthcare workers is escapism. Get away, pull back, detach, go on a nature hike or a vacation, or do yoga. I get it. Sometimes you need to just get away. And I believe that things that help you relax have their place, but I was not buying that escapism was the answer. My intuition and my 20 years of experience told me that the true antidote, to burnout was not an escaping, but rather at the point of care. After a rigorous systematic review of the biomedical literature and newly armed with all the scientific data that compassion can be a powerful therapy for the giver too, I believe the solution was in more human connection, not less. That was my hypothesis. So in searching for recovery from burnout, I did the only thing I knew how to do. I took the research nerd approach. I decided to test the hypothesis by doing an experiment on myself. In this experiment, there was only one study subject, me. I was the N of 1. I tested the hypothesis that having more compassion for others would transform my own experience. I gave patients my 40 seconds of compassion. I connected more, not less, cared more, not less, leaned in rather than pulling back. And that was when the fog of burnout began to lift for me. Being intentional about compassion and giving others my 40 seconds of compassion changed everything. But let's be clear, you don't have to be a healthcare worker to feel burned out. And if you're feeling this way, consider testing the compassion hypothesis for yourself. Try your own N of 1 experiment. See those in need around you and give them your 40 seconds of compassion every opportunity that you have, and see how it transforms your experience. But don't do it because I say so. Do it because science says so. So Bill, the physician that submitted that story, it was actually me. It's my story of going through burnout personally. And I found that compassion makes all the difference for all the reasons that Richie and Jinpa showed that go back forever and ever. It transformed my world today.
It's very powerful, Stephen. I think it combines those two elements that you raised, both the meaning, but also, right, the human meaning, but also the science behind it. You use the neuroscience of empathy and compassion to inform your own practice. And the world's better for it. You're better for it, but also your patients are better for it. So it's very powerful.
Thank you.
There are so many important connections between physicians and their patients. And there's so many reasons to think that we have a huge job ahead of us at the Institute for understanding what's holding us back. And our analysis so far suggests that it is about training doctors to be themselves, if you will. It is about helping them to harness their own empathy and compassion. But it's also a very real challenge for systems of medicine, because we know that much of what blunts one's ability are those pressures of time and financial issues and schedules and the electronic health record that really plague us as physicians. So I think there's a long way to go, but I think understanding and embracing our traditions, exploring the neuroscience of empathy and compassion, and letting all of that come together in both meaning and science at the bedside is a way we can proceed with some confidence that we will have done our job and that the world will be a better place. I want to thank all the speakers. Great to have you here. Great friends, great colleagues. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Bill.
man.
Thanks
Thank
so
you.
much.